She fell asleep with her resume on a millionaire's shoulder. What happened next changed everything. The plane rocked gently over the Atlantic. Outside the oval window, the lights of São Paulo bled into a smear of gold. Inside, Júlia Andrade was a small, exhausted island of clothes and papers. Her head lolled against the man in the next seat, briefly, awkwardly, after a night of waiting rooms and interviews and counting coins. Her resume, slightly crumpled from being folded and refolded, had been tucked under her arm. A folded sheet of paper, edges damp from a single angry tear, was pinned to the top with a paperclip. She didn't notice when the clip slipped free. She didn't notice when the pages, caught by a sigh and the mingled drafts of air conditioning and tired breath, slid across the armrest and came to rest against the sleeve of the man beside her. She slept because she finally could. The long, thin release of someone who has run on hope enough hours that exhaustion becomes its own mercy. The man in the adjacent seat glanced down on habit. He was used to noticing details, a habit that had made his name and his company. He saw the resume first, professional and handwritten notes in the margins, but what hooked him wasn't the layout or the fonts. It was the single sheet on top. The paper looked like an apology and a promise sewn together. There were smudges where ink had met skin and rain, a shaky line at the top that read, in Portuguese, "To whoever will read this when I'm too tired to explain." The man, Leonardo Santana, felt his fingers move before his mind did. He knew in an abstract way that reading someone's private words without permission was wrong. He also knew what it felt like to be the person who needed to be seen. A memory pushed up, smaller, rawer than any image in his glossy biography. A younger version of himself on a dusty bus, a crumpled application in his lap, a night without dinner because rent ate the paycheck. In that flash he tasted hunger, the sharp metallic sting of a wallet with 3 crumpled bills. The paper trembled in his hand. He read. The words were simple. They were shamefully tender. They were the kind of confession you write when you're trying to explain why you keep getting up. I am tired of telling people I'm ready, when sometimes I am not. There was a list, half-planned goals, half-plea, things she wanted to make for clients, places she could design and change if given the chance. There were reasons she couldn't sleep on planes other than physical tiredness, the weight of being from Recife, of being the daughter who sent money home, of a mother who believed in small miracles. There was, under all of it, the outline of a person who loved creating and had been told often enough that what she made was not what the market wanted. When Júlia stirred, blinking sleep out of her eyes, Leonardo looked up quickly, as if he'd been caught reaching into someone else's pocket.
He folded the paper, smoothed the resume with careful fingers, and offered them both to her with a half-embarrassed smile. "I'm sorry," he said in Portuguese. His voice was quieter than the plane hum. "I shouldn't have." Júlia's eyes, reddened around the rims, narrowed and then softened. For a moment there was the reflexive defense of someone who had had to guard herself for months. Jobs lost with polite texts, interviews that evaporated into silence. Then she saw his face properly, the fine lines at the corners, the kindness framed behind an easy anonymity, the watch that didn't shout wealth but suggested it comfortably existed. Reading him like a resume, she might have guessed investor, entrepreneur, someone who had made choices that left him far from the bench of her own worries. "It's all right," she said. Her voice was small, edged with humor she hadn't planned to spend tonight. People read things they aren't supposed to when they're bored on planes. He made a soft, rueful sound. "I wasn't bored." He paused. "I was moved. I know how bad it takes to look at a blank bank account and call it hope." She blinked. "You do?" He nodded. "Once. Not recent. A long time ago." In his mind's eye, he put the memory back into focus. A cheap hostel in a city that did not feel like home. A stack of rejection emails. A single person who had once offered him a job because she saw a stubborn quality in his resume. He had been given a hand when he needed it. That hand, improbably, was the reason he was on this flight tonight, returning from a conference with a head full of introductions and a phone loaded with names. Júlia looked at him, cataloging the facts, the difference between confession and pity. "Why tell me all this?" she asked, teasing to soften the question. "If you were broke, you could have been sympathetic. If you left, maybe you're just trying to feel better." "Because the words you wrote, they felt like a mirror," Leonardo said. "Not of me now, but of a version of me who never got that one break. And I thought maybe I could help in the way I once was helped." It would have been easier if he had offered cash or given a card and walked away. That would have left the story neatly transactional, simple, and unsurprising. But Leonardo's response had a different shape. He apologized for the intrusion, then confessed his misstep, and then, after a hesitant breath, offered to make introductions. "You can say no," he added quickly. "I don't want you to owe me anything. I'm not looking to buy your gratitude." Júlia turned the resume between her fingers. The corner of the handwritten sheet brushed her thumb. I felt the moisture there and the human honesty. I thought of her mother, of the small apartment in São Paulo where the couch had become both bed and workspace, of the client who had asked her to change the soul out of a logo because it wasn't commercial enough.
She also knew the ways well-intentioned pity could weigh heavier than a salary. She had been offered help before that came wrapped in expectation. "I'm not promising anything," she said slowly, "but a name is a name. An introduction doesn't fix everything, but it can start it." He smiled then, relieved. They spoke a little more, about noise on night flights, about Recife's humidity versus São Paulo's constant motion, until the plane announced descent and the cabin lightened like a slow exhale. Leonardo wrote his contacts on the back of the boarding pass in neat, steady letters. A founder of a small branding collective named Mariana at Raiz Creativa, a creative director who freelanced, another entrepreneur who was always looking for designers who could think strategy. He slid the scrap across in a gesture that was equal parts businesslike and oddly intimate. When they stepped out into the humid São Paulo night, the city smelled like diesel and grilled meat and something alive. Júlia hugged her thin jacket around herself and thought of home. She had one night to sleep on the couch and another interview in 3 days. Between here and Recife was a list of obligations and an even longer list of misgivings. Yet in her pocket, the folded paper felt like a small charged thing, part apology, part possibility. If you love stories about second chances, tap like and subscribe. This one is worth the ride. Back at her apartment, the posters she'd taped to the wall, worn, intimate, the traces of a life built of fragments, seemed to lean closer. Her mother, Dona Rosa, called that evening to check if she'd arrived home safe. The call folded over the routine and the tenderness. Dona Rosa's voice was a warm, sturdy presence that locked pieces of Júlia back into place. "Eat, Filia," she said. "Don't let this city eat you." Júlia laughed, and the sound was a little raw with relief. There was no overnight miracle. Leonardo's names went into her draft folder. She stared at them, at the way the letters formed, and then set to work the way she had learned to set to work, pragmatically, methodically, with the small insistence of someone who had rehearsed persistence. She rewrote her resume again, but differently this time, not in the clean, academic way that often attracted corporate recruiters, but as a story of craft. Her portfolio pages, digitized late into the night, showcased the work she wanted to keep doing: branding for social enterprises, campaigns for local causes, tactile design that spoke human. She wrote a note to Mariana that was short and true. "My name is Júlia Andrade. I'm a designer from Recife. I make brands for people who need to be heard, not sold. Leonardo Santana suggested I reach out." Within 48 hours, Mariana's calendar pinged into her email, a 30-minute video interview, the time stamped like a small green promise. Weeks unspooled in a series of small, sharp scenes.
There were nights when Julia's savings seemed smaller than yesterday. There were hours logged for a freelance client who paid late and a rejection email that used the same polite template as the last. There were other hours too. Long stretches at the small table by the window where she rearranged the same color palette until it said the thing she wanted it to say. A coffee shop that did discounts at 3 in the afternoon. Messages from Rafael and Camila. Friends who understood both the hunger and the ludicrous sense that the right project was just one email away. She didn't expect miracles. What she expected, properly, was more of the same. Rejection wrapped in hopeful language. But there were differences shaping up. Leonardo's introductions were not a single dramatic push. They arrived as a set of doors left ajar. He sent brief emails. "Mariana, this is Júlia. Júlia, Mariana. No pressure. She can do work that matters." He copied a few notes about the kinds of projects he thought would fit Júlia. Community-driven campaigns, startups with a conscience, teams that needed design not as ornament but as nucleus. Sometimes he wrote longer messages in which he confessed quietly his own mistakes from years ago, how he had accepted a role because it seemed the safe choice, only to find himself bored and unmoored later. Those confessions had the soft effect of equalizing the power between them. He was not a savior parachuting down. He was a man who remembered a lonelier version of himself and felt a nudge to act differently. The day of the first video call with Mariana, Júlia ran her hands through her hair like a massage, rearranged the background until the shelf behind her displayed art that looked lived in but deliberate, and sat with a notebook where she had written 3 key points. She did not rehearse a persona. Instead, she practiced one truth she had learned the hard way. The best interview is rarely the one where you hide who you are. Mariana's face filled the little rectangle on her screen. Sharp eyes, and energy that suggested she had built things from scratch and kept the parts that mattered. Her tone was brisk but curious. "Show me something you're proud of," Mariana said.
Júlia clicked through, narrating as she went. The constraints of a job for a nonprofit, the decision to hand-draw typographic elements because machine fonts felt too sterilized, the way she had argued for color that belonged to a place rather than a trend. She talked about client briefs that wanted trends. She talked about clients who wanted hearts. She talked about Recife in a few sentences, not as a postcard but as an origin for the way she worked. At one point, Mariana leaned closer to the screen. "You don't look like someone who modifies their work to fit a template," she said, the compliment falling less like praise than like a map. "That's rare and necessary." Júlia felt the heat in her chest.
For months, she'd been measured against templates that valued scalars over soul. Listening felt like oxygen. She kept talking because she had to, because this mattered more than the perfect phrasing. She spoke about a campaign she had launched for a community garden, about a logo that doubled as a fundraiser tool, about a letter she wrote to donors that was not polished but honest. "How do you handle pressure?" Mariana asked later, direct, the question that business people ask to find out who will crumble first. "The same way I handle hunger," Júlia said. "I plan for it. I save the small wins for larger ones. I don't pretend it doesn't exist. I ask for help when I need it." "Who taught you to ask for help?" Mariana asked. "My mother," Júlia said, "and the people who've stayed." Mariana nodded as if that answered everything. After 15 minutes, she smiled. "We have a project that starts in 6 weeks. It's small, but it's meaningful. We need someone who can hold both craft and conscience. I'm going to talk to the team." That evening, Julia's phone buzzed with a terse message from Leonardo. How did it go? She answered with honesty, how the questions cut deeper than she expected, how the connection felt real, how a single compliment had steadied her. He sent back a single line. "Good. Keep going." No one pushed. He understood the slow momentum of these things. Montage could compress months into minutes, but each frame had to land on the skin. There were late nights redesigning a pitch deck until the color felt like the voice of the product. There were 2 small freelance projects that paid enough to make the gas into her mother's town ticket possible and to place a bottle of olive oil, the good one, on the table. There were mornings when she would walk the Avenida Paulista and study people whose style suggested options, not obligations, and remind herself that they were not the measurement of her worth. Then came the official email from Mariana. The project at Raíz Creativa was hers. It was a 3-month contract with the possibility of extension and a first client who wanted to reposition a local cooperative market. The salary wasn't extravagant, but it was a wage that would make months feel like breathing instead of holding. When Júlia read the words on her phone screen, "We'd like to offer you the contract," she felt an odd, vertiginous gratitude that tasted like fear and relief braided together. She called Dona Rosa and handed the phone so that her mother could hear the message in Portuguese between the choked pluralities of her daughter's laugh. "Filha," Dona Rosa said, voice thick and immediate, "I am so proud." That night, Júlia allowed herself a small celebration, a pizza ordered not for the cheapest slice, but for the one with flavors she loved. She ate alone at the small table, the city outside buzzing, and thought of the letter again, the way it had been folded and read. She thought about Leonardo's intrusion and his apology and the edges around both, an ethical problem that had turned into a possibility. She had not reached this place because someone had handed it to her. She had reached it because she had accepted help and then worked for it. The offer came with a practical question attached, a start date that conflicted with a planned trip to Recife to help her mother with some paperwork. The dates felt like a test in small things, of deciding whose needs were front, and Júlia messaged back, negotiating the start by proposing a week later. Raíz Creativa accepted. Negotiating, she realized, was also part of agency. Leonardo emailed a brief congratulations, and then, in a way that surprised her, a question. "Do you want to meet at the office? I owe you a coffee that doesn't sit awkwardly in the hallway of a plane." She laughed when she read it, thumb hovering over the reply. The invitation felt like an ordinary kindness. No strings, no ceremonies. She agreed. When they met, it was in the thin rain that São Paulo favors, the kind that leans at an angle and leaves the city in a soft blur. Leonardo was already there, by the storefront window of a small cafe, his coat damp, a scarf looped once around his neck. He looked like someone who wore his life with precision and an easy charm. It was a version of him she was getting to know in increments, generous in small touches, apologetic where necessary, distant when business called his name. They talked simply, about schedules and how the first weeks would probably be chaotic, about her mother, about the way creative work sometimes escaped budget lines. He listened to the way she described her tasks as Raíz and nodded like a man who respected the mechanics of craft. "I want you to know I didn't mean to overstep," Leonardo said finally, his hands wrapped around his coffee. "Reading your letter was wrong. I know that. It doesn't make it less true that something in your writing hit me, but I'm aware of the line I crossed." She considered the apology. "You admitted it," she said. "That's a start."
He smiled, relieved. "I don't want gratitude for doing what's right," he said. "I want you to know I understand the difference." They moved on to lighter things, because life asks for balance. Favorite neighborhoods, the best place to get acarajé in São Paulo that reminded her of Recife, work schedules. Conversation filled small gaps that might have otherwise been awkward. There was a quality of normalcy to it that was both calming and strange. She had not expected such easy rapport with someone whose business cards would look shiny under any light. Leonardo didn't offer further favors that day. There was no grand gesture, no whispered promise of contacts beyond those he'd already sent. What he gave was steadiness. An email introduction he had finalized that morning to Mariana, a concise, non-effusive endorsement that left the rest to Julia's portfolio and temperament.
"She's capable and honest," he had written. "I believe in the work she wants to do." The belief was not a magic key. It was a door opening to a hall with other doors, and inside those rooms sat schedules, teams, and moods that might not fit her design the way she'd imagined. But the opening mattered. It made a chain reaction possible, and for Julia, that was sufficient to keep walking. Work at Raiz began with the kind of orientation that is both banal and revealing. The office smelled of coffee and new paper and a collaboration ethic that prized ideas over hierarchy. Mariana introduced her to the team, 2 copywriters, a strategist named Feltro, a junior designer, and a discordant printer who loved old typefaces. They threw around words with a particular rhythm: empathy, impact, ritual. Julia liked that they did not shy from saying the word community without making it sound like filler. The cooperative market client they were taking on wanted to reframe itself as the heart of a neighborhood rather than a sterile vendor list. It was the kind of project that required humility as much as creativity. In the first week, she sketched, painted, argued about a logotype, and walked home with sticky notes in her head. The money that folded into her account at the end of the month didn't erase memories of nearly empty nights, but it made one thing possible: the ability to breathe when she slept. She found herself dreaming new compositions, waking with a color palette in her mouth. People noticed. Mariana sent a message to Leonardo at some point, an offhanded, appreciative note that mattered less in scale than in tone. There were small victories. Her concept for the cooperative's poster series was used in a pilot campaign that saw more foot traffic than the client expected. There were setbacks, too. A municipal permit delayed a launch, and one vendor refused to change his signage because it had felt like a piece of him for 20 years. The team navigated compromise, celebrated small gains, and kept the work honest. During those first weeks, Leonardo would occasionally send a neutral, practical message, a link to an article, a contact who might need design thinking for a startup incubator, a question about the way she was adjusting to the team. He never asked for more than she willingly offered. Sometimes he sent a personal memory, like a photograph of a shabby workshop where he'd sketched the first logo for his first company, an old Polaroid that showed a younger man with ink on his fingers. The act of sharing small past failures became for both of them a currency that replaced power with proximity. At home, between projects, she wrote a short letter to herself, part gratitude, part instruction. She taped it to the back of a calendar. Do not let gratitude become submission. Keep making. Ask for what you need. Call your mother every week. The letter she had written on the plane, that tear-stained private thing, she folded and slipped into a drawer.
Sometimes when she couldn't sleep, she unfolded it and read the sentences she had written in the middle of the night, because the words felt like geography now. They mapped a path from old fears to new habits. Not all introductions turned into work. Some replies from Leonardo's network were polite declines. Others were long conversations that led nowhere. That was part of the lesson. Access did not equal certainty. Yet one email, flagged and waiting at the top of her inbox after a long day at the office, read, "We'd like you to lead the pilot visual for our community cooperative. Compensation attached. Start date in 3 weeks. Signed, Raiz Creativa." She read it 3 times in the cafe near the office, the steam from her coffee fogging the glass and turning the city into a soft watercolor. Her hands shook in a familiar way, the same small tremor she used to get when a client actually said yes. She stepped outside into the wet air and called her mother. Dona Rosa's voice was immediate: pride, concern, instructions about what to bring to the event the cooperative was planning. It all felt real and fragile and immense. Leonardo messaged that evening. Did they offer? How do you feel? She typed a reply that was honest and unadorned. They did.
grateful and terrified. He answered with a simple, steady line. "Good. I'm here if you need anything. No fanfare, no conditions." That night she couldn't sleep, not because she feared failure. She liked the sting of mistakes, but because the future had shifted its weight beneath her feet. There were practical concerns to navigate. The timeline of the project would mean less freelance time, a shorter leash on pay, more negotiation with clients who might not want to cede control. There were relational questions she hadn't yet dared ask herself. What would it mean to be connected to the person who had, in a complicated way, made this possible? How quickly would small and private things become obligations? She lay with these questions like a list of chores, not yet tasks to complete. On a Wednesday morning, as the team assembled in a cramped conference room filled with mood boards and leftover breakfast pastries, Mariana interrupted the meeting with a half grin. "By the way," she said, "Leonardo asked if it would be all right to drop by next week. He wants to see the pilot." A muffled chorus of thanks passed around the table. Júlia felt her pulse quickened for reasons that were not entirely professional. This was the man who had read her letter. This was the man who had sent the introduction. And yet, standing on the threshold of a new responsibility, she was determined to keep the work at the center. When Leonardo arrived, he walked in like someone who had practiced being unobtrusive. He listened intently as Mariana outlined the strategy. He offered a few neutral observations that were useful without being domineering.
At one point, he looked directly at Júlia and asked about the color stories and why she had chosen earth tones for the cooperative, why she had married modern type with hand-drawn icons. "Because the market is old and alive," she said. "People recognize themselves in the hand, not the machine." He nodded, and after the meeting, he sidled up to her outside, where the sun had woken the city for just a moment between clouds. "You did well," he said. "You held the room." "Thank you," she said. It felt awkward to accept praise that had adjacent implications. He had been part of the chain that led her here, but she did not want to pretend the journey was a simple, solitary climb. "I meant what I said on the plane," Leonardo added. "I crossed a line by reading your letter. I'm still sorry. But I'm also glad you opened the door. I'll give advice when it's wanted and step back when it's not. Those are my only promises." She studied him. He looked earnest in a way that was hard to resist. "That's fair," she said. Not everything settled into neat boxes. A week later, a freelance client missed a payment. A municipal permit for the cooperative event required a last-minute redesign. A former colleague sent a message asking whether she would mentor an intern, and her schedule made her realize she would have to decline. Life kept interrupting, the way life does, with small frictions and big certainties. The offer from Raiz remained real. So did the ethical discomfort of how it had come to be. A private letter, a man's impulse, a network that could open little gates. But the job was hers because she had done the work, and because she had kept showing up. She balanced both truths like two plates in her hands. On a late afternoon, leaving the office, she paused at a crosswalk and let the city swallow her. Her phone buzzed. The message was from Leonardo. "There's a design roundtable Saturday. If you want to, come." He didn't add more. No pressure, no insistence. The invitation felt like a thread thrown into a river she had already decided to travel. She looked at the screen, then at the city, then back to the screen, and she typed, "Maybe. Thank you." As she walked home, the sky dimmed to the blue of a drum. The city lit up in small incandescent decisions. Someone opening a shop, someone closing a deal, someone learning to live with less. Her apartment waited with its small comforts. In the drawer, the folded letter sought like a map of how she had once been, and how she might continue to be. She did not know, sitting there in the gathering night, how the next months would thread themselves through work and companionship, how the man whose shoulder had caught her papers would figure into the pattern of her life. She only knew the immediate facts: an offer in hand, a mother who celebrated, a new team that asked for courageous payment, a man who had apologized and then helped.
And a more private truth, that she had moved from survival into a kind of labor that felt like living. That, for now, was enough. When the calendar blinked with the date of the cooperative's first pilot, Leonardo sent a short message, "I'm coming to watch." She read it, feeling the old mixture of gratitude and distance, and texted back, "See you there." The pilot day arrived like a drum roll, quiet, then sudden. Vendors lined the street with banners that bore Júlia's colors. People paused, read, smiled. Sales were modest but steady. Neighbors who had only known the market in passing stopped and lingered. One vendor, an older man who had resisted all changes, tapped her shoulder and said, "You made this look like home." The team celebrated in a small, practical way. Coffee and leftover pastries in the office, notes on what to adjust. Mariana clapped Júlia on the back. "We keep going," she said, and everyone laughed because the phrase was both directive and prayer. Later that evening, Júlia rode the subway home with tired knees and a phone heavy with messages. congrats, questions, a couple of invoices to send. She stopped at a grocery store and bought a small cake because it felt like an offering to mark the day. At home, alone with the hum of the refrigerator and a city that no longer felt like a threat, but a place with rooms she could afford, she sat down with the cake and the folded letter from the plane. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Leonardo, not with business, but with a photograph, a Polaroid of the sepia-stained bus where he'd once sketched logos, and a caption that read in Portuguese, "For memory, for reasons that stay with us." She stared at the image and felt something unlatch, not a sudden surrender or a promise, but the loosening of a tightness she'd carried for years. She folded the paper up and slid it back into the drawer with the others. Maps, promises, old versions of herself. Outside, the city spread wide and indifferent. She had a job that asked a lot, and a man who had done something ethically messy and then tried to make it right. Both things would require tending. For now, she sat with a fork and a small cake and allowed herself one unguarded bite. She had come from a place where a night's sleep was a rare luxury. Now she found herself planning projects and thinking in color palettes, wondering what the next challenge would be. The future felt less like a cliff and more like a staircase. A week later, Mariana called with news that expanded the small orbit of her career. A brand festival in Salvador had invited Raiz to present their pilot. The festival could be a platform, a way to meet other cooperatives. The invitation came with travel covered. Júlia closed her eyes at the sound of the words and let the city spin a little slower. That evening, Leonardo sent a brief note, proud.
And then, unexpectedly, he wrote another line, short, precise, without any undertow of control. "If you're willing, I'd like to introduce you to some people at the festival. No obligation. I can be a connector, nothing more." Júlia reread it. The word connector felt like a clean, honest role. Someone who opens doors but leaves the work inside the rooms. She typed back, "Yes, thank you." Her thumb hovered before she sent it. Then she added, "For the record, I'm not doing this because you asked. I'm doing it because I want this." He answered with a single emoji that was oddly human, a small, earnest smile. Then, in the quiet that followed, she felt the pulse of possibility, soft, persistent, not yet resolved. The festival invitation arrived like a small flare in a dim sky, an acknowledgement that what she had done mattered enough to be shown beyond the tight orbit of her office. Salvador felt far in both distance and tone, old colonial streets, salt in the air, a different rhythm, but Raiz Creativa insisted it was the right place to show what the cooperative pilot had done. Leonardo's offer to introduce people there made it feel less like being thrust onto a stage and more like being invited by someone who had already taken the time to read the script. She flew to Salvador with a notebook filled with tweaks and a suitcase that smelled faintly of São Paulo rain. The festival was bigger than she had expected. Rows of booths, a crowd that looked at design the way others looked at weather, attentive and slightly suspicious. Júlia's hands were steady as she set up the pilot visuals. The posters fit on the walls like doors in a hallway. The crowd gathered, and people looked, then lingered, then asked. A small publisher from Recife recognized the hand-drawn iconography and wanted to talk about a booklet. A cooperative from Bahia asked if the campaign could be adapted to their market. Mariana moved through the crowd the way a conductor does at a rehearsal, pulling the right people into the right conversations. Leonardo arrived the second day, unexpectedly at the back of one talk, an almost familiar constellation of presence, calm, unobtrusive, but there. He watched her move through her work as if reading a score, and when she noticed him, he gave a short, private smile, the corners of his eyes softening as if to say, "You." Later, at a small dinner organized by one of the festival sponsors, he introduced her to a group of people whose work braided tech and social impact, accelerators, small funders, a designer from Lisbon who had a soft-voiced interest in community campaigns. Each introduction was casual, efficient, and respectful of her control in the room. At the end of the festival, an editor from a niche magazine asked if she'd contribute an essay on how design can hold memory. It was the sort of request that asked for more than polish. It wanted her voice. Mariana looked at her with a small conspiratorial grin.
"They want your words as much as your drawings," she said. Júlia accepted. She wrote on the plain back, sketching sentences and color choices between sleep and the invisible lines of the runway. Leonardo messaged later that night. How did it go? She texted a short reply, better than I expected. He sent back a photograph of the Polaroid boss, this time an addendum, a message in which he admitted that seeing her speak had felt like seeing a prediction come to pass. Weeks turned into months with the steady, unglamorous work of building something that would last. The cooperative campaign scaled slowly. A second pilot in a neighboring community. Negotiations about signage that held memory and met regulations. A piece in that niche magazine that widened her name by a quiet degree. Offers came, some polite and flimsy, others real enough to demand decisions. She had to refuse a few projects that would dilute the kind of work she wanted to keep doing. Each refusal felt like choosing a different kind of failure, a careful curation rather than blind acceptance. Leonardo remained in the perimeter of these scenes the way a reliable weather pattern remains at the edge of a map, consistent, not overwhelming. He introduced her to a small group of social entrepreneurs who wanted design thinking for program materials. He emailed a potential client, but never more than a line, "Julia is someone I think you should meet," and then let the rest play out. He was careful with praise and economical with advice. When he interceded, it was to call attention to something he'd noticed in a meeting, an overlooked funding opportunity, a shorter timeline that could be negotiated, not a hand extended with strings. Between professional momentum and the slow creep of familiarity, their relationship developed in a pattern of small, mutual disclosures. They met for coffee and, occasionally, for dinners that were more conversation than performance. Leonardo told her about a project he'd turned down a year ago because it required bending his principles. The anecdote was short, almost shy, and it made him human in ways that business press never would. She told him about designing her first logo on a beachside night in Recife, the paper sticky with salt, the fonts clumsy and sincere. There were moments that felt like tests in miniature. He called once in the middle of the week, voice low. He had a meeting that would take him out of town for 2 weeks and wanted to know if she'd be comfortable meeting someone who might want to collaborate with Rais in his absence. She hesitated, not because of the meeting itself, but because of the shape of the request. She was protective of the line between his introductions and her work. She remembered the private letter folded in a drawer and how a man's curiosity had started this. "If it's useful, sure," she told him, "but I want to run the conversation. If it feels like something else, I'll tell you." He agreed.
He was learning not only to open doors for her, but to step back from the doorway. A real test came when a larger opportunity arose. An agency that worked with environmental nonprofits wanted someone to lead an initiative across several coastal towns. It was bigger than what she'd done before, and the compensation was tempting. The catch, it would require more travel, less time at Rais, and a commitment that might stretch her thin. The proposal came with a meeting in Brasilia and a presentation before a panel that cared about metrics and impact statements. Julia prepared with the same meticulousness she used on projects that mattered. She mapped the social return of the cooperative pilot, translated local gains into broader metrics without losing the story, and rehearsed the presentation until it felt like telling a story rather than performing a sales pitch. Leonardo offered to help, but this time he called it. He would sit in on a practice run only if she wanted him to. Otherwise, he would leave her room. They practiced once together. He gave small critiques. Try less jargon. Tell the story first. Then watched from the back as she said the words in the real room, and the panel listened. She won the contract. The work would be intensive and taxing, but it also promised growth and the ability to refine a method she believed in. She accepted and negotiated a timeline that allowed her to fulfill the remaining Rais obligations and then step into the new role. When she told Leonardo, he sent a message that was simply, "Proud." She replied, "It's going to be hard." He wrote back, "I'll be here." The two words were steady like a taut rope. Not everything moved steadily upward. 6 months in, one of the cooperative vendors decided to withdraw from a pilot because his sister fell ill and he needed to focus on her care. Money tightened again. The municipal grant that had looked likely evaporated with political redirection. For a week, she felt the ancient hunger tighten in her stomach. She stayed late at the office, sent invoices, called a friend who ran a microloan cooperative, and found ways to keep the project afloat. She called her mother less frequently for fear of the worry in Dona Rosa's voice. The calls she did make were spare and practical. Leonardo's role here was consistent but small. He forwarded an email he thought might help, and then when she explained the immediate needs, he connected her to a pro bono legal consultant who could help with paperwork for a new funding application. He never offered money. The consultants he introduced had reasons beyond him for saying yes. They cared about community projects, or they were looking for a case study. Julia set the meetings, wrote the applications, and breathed the nights into a rhythm of negotiation. When the funding came through, partial, not everything they'd hoped, she wrote down a list of what would be possible.
She left the drawer with the plain letter unlocked sometimes, and felt each decision echo in the sentences she'd once forced herself to write. The romance was a slow addition to their professional entanglements, growing in margins, on the subway, in late emails, in impromptu dinners. There were tendernesses that arrived like small weather events, Leonardo bringing soup when she was sick, Julia staying up late to write a proposal and sending him a voice message of triumph. Each gesture was considered and reciprocal. Neither expected the other to obliterate their previous lives. But as the months accumulated, practical questions loomed larger. Julia's mother needed more support in Recife. The cooperative's expansion required a local presence. Raíz's projects demanded consistent contribution in São Paulo. Leonardo's life was anchored in São Paulo. His company was here, his teams, his investors. They spoke about distance like two people negotiating a map. She considered moving back to Recife permanently for a while to manage the cooperative's local work, but the São Paulo projects were where she was building a layered career. The alternative, a constant commute, felt unsustainable. They confronted the problem in the only way they knew how, with a conversation that built out logistics like architecture. On a Saturday afternoon, in a small park that smelled of cut grass and sunlight, they spread out a city map on a low bench between them and sketched a plan. "What if we try split living?" Leonardo suggested, cautious, as if trying a new word for the first time. "You keep a base in São Paulo and a base in Recife. I could come down more often. We could set blocks, 3 weeks here, 1 week there. We can book around big project dates." She listened, thinking of airfare, her mother, the cooperative vendors, the time she needed in the studio. The plan had blunt edges. It would mean months of packing and implicit acceptance of movement as routine. "And you?" she asked. "Do you really think you can be in Recife enough to matter?" He looked at her, the sunlight making a line in his hair. "I can try," he said. "I have teams that can run without me. I can shift time. But I don't want to promise something I can't keep." She took a breath. "I don't want to be a side project," she said. "I want this to be real. I want to keep growing." He nodded, his expression aligning with the gravity of the sentence. "Then let's design it, not as a grand sacrifice, but as a structure we try for 6 months." They wrote conditions, practical, almost bureaucratic. She insisted on clear work boundaries, no meetings that demanded immediate travel with at least a week's notice. She wanted agency to accept projects without consulting him. He insisted on transparency, schedule shared, anticipations named, and an agreement to revisit the plan monthly.
It sounded clinical when they read it out loud, but the exercise was an act of trust. They were willing to build their life like a small company, with terms and signals and the willingness to change course. They tried it. The first month was clumsy. Packing and unpacking became a ritual. Júlia learned to leave a pair of shoes at both places and to treat her suitcase like a coworker. Leonardo spent long weekends in Recife, the city surprising him with its own pace. He learned how to sit through a long vendor meeting and not rush the interruptions. He learned to buy groceries in a small market where the owner remembered his name. Júlia found a rhythm in flitting between studios, each transfer a folding and unfolding of herself. There were nights when the plane felt like a small betrayal. Flying from one life to another felt at times like moving paper across a table. Through it all, they continued to put work first in the most literal sense. The policies they made were respected. Each time a difficulty threatened, an unexpected meeting, an invoice that went wrong, they handled it directly. When a small crisis hit, a shipment delay for printed materials before a major market day in Recife, Júlia managed vendors and deadlines with surgical calm. Leonardo, for his part, used his influence to push for better shipping rates through a logistics contact he'd once helped. The discount was not a gift so much as a negotiated term, and Júlia handled the logistics that made it effective. The months required conversation and sometimes argument. They disagreed about small things that revealed larger fears. Once, after a long week when Júlia canceled plans to finish a grant proposal, Leonardo's tone carried an edge. "It feels like your work is always the first to take precedence," he said one night, tired. "I know your career matters to you. I just miss you." She heard the tenderness under the complaint and the resentful loneliness, and though the words tempted a quick defense, the list of what she'd given up to be present, she chose instead to answer plainly. "I miss you too," she said. "But the thing I want us to have is a life where both of us can do the work that matters. We need rules that let that happen." They argued until the night thinned into a practical agreement. They would block evenings for each other once per week. They would book travel with mutual consultation. They would keep a shared calendar that honored both work and personal time. The agreement was not a panacea. There were nights when work ate them both. There were mornings when one felt resentful that the other had to cancel. But the rules served as guardrails more than prisons. Autonomy remained crucial to both. When Leonardo, months later, suggested they think about a shared project, an incubator for socially minded startups that would intentionally include a design fellowship, Júlia listened with care.
He framed it as a collaborative venture that would codify the lessons she was learning into scholarships, mentorships, and small stipends. On first hearing, it sounded like the kind of initiative that could tip into patronage. She had been wary of help that looked like control. "Who's in charge?" she asked bluntly in a cafe, the city all wash of sound around them. "You are," he said. His answer was quiet, deliberate. "I invest, you design the criteria. I will create the steering committee, but you will set the priorities. If at any point you say this is not serving you or the fellows, we stop." She considered the offer. It would be laborious, but it would also be a way to create a structure that channeled introductions and funding into a framework that valued agency.
She agreed on the condition that the fellowship terms be co-authored by practitioners from a set of partner communities, including people she trusted in Recife. They launched the fellowship 6 months later. Júlia wrote the application questions and sat through panels that felt like 100 small decisions. The first cohort included 3 designers from regional towns, an agile programmer from Salvador, and a community organizer from Ceará. They taught, learned, and argued. The fellowship produced projects that might never have existed otherwise. Simple things like a mobile interface for a farmers' cooperative and a printed mapping booklet that helped elders map market histories. Leonardo kept his promise to step back. When funders asked for a prominent name to speak at events, he deferred to Júlia. In public moments, he would introduce her as the project's curator and then sit quietly as she spoke. The public perception eased into something less sensational and more ordinary. A man read an intimate letter, he apologized, he opened a few doors, and a woman used those doors to build something. Where tabloids might have wanted scandal, the world offered more useful exchanges: panels, guest lectures, a profile that noted her craft and the soft humility of her approach. Júlia appeared less as a rescued heroine and more like a leader who had endured consistent, often brutal gatekeeping and had responded with patience and skill.
Their relationship deepened into a kind of domestic ritual that was careful and chosen. They cooked sometimes, Leonardo learning how to fold acarajé with fumbling competence, Júlia taking over a sauce he had burned once and smiling at his apology. They kept each other's confidences. He read a short, yellowing list he kept in his desk of decisions that had shaped him, and she showed him a sketchbook where she kept early marks, messy, unpolished, dear. In those exchanges, they measured risk and tenderness. The symbolic moment, a ring, did not happen in a flash, nor in a scene of cinematic confession. Instead, it arrived after a long Saturday when the air pressed warm and the city moved slowly. They had spent the day sorting through fellowship applications and meeting small merchants. The evening quieted into a diner where the lights were soft and the jukebox played songs neither of them could name. Leonardo had been unusually quiet, picking at his bread. At one point, he asked to walk her home. They walked with shoulders brushing, the city an attentive witness. At her door, he stopped and took something from his pocket, small, wrapped in a rectangle of kitchen paper. He unfolded it with the same unobtrusive care he gave business gestures. Inside was a simple, unadorned band of silver, not flashy, the kind of ring that belonged to something like a promise rather than a pronouncement. He had found it in a small artisan shop and had asked the maker to keep the piece unpolished because he wanted it to age, to carry marks of ordinary life. "I don't want to put you on a timeline," he said, voice low and a little raw. "I don't want to buy your silence or make you owe me anything. This isn't a demand. I am asking for something I don't yet have the language for. Permission to keep building with you, to be present as you build, to try to make space for you and with you." She held the ring in her palm, felt its coolness, and thought of the months they'd spent balancing calendars and drafting boundaries, of nights spent boxed in deadlines, of mornings when she'd woken to find a message that was full of quiet support. He was asking, in effect, for a non-binding partnership, a pledge to continue, to try as equals. "I want a life that keeps my work sacred," she said, looking at him in the dim light. "I want a promise that allows me to refuse things that aren't mine. I want us to be honest when it gets hard." He nodded, eyes steady. "Those are the terms I want too. I promise not to make decisions for you. I promise to show up. I promise to step back when you ask. I promise to try and fail at being here in a way that doesn't hurt you." She laughed then, a small, incredulous sound that carried a relief. "That sounds like the least romantic set of vows I've ever heard," she said, and he smiled because he'd preferred practical language to theatrical pronouncements. She slid the ring onto her thumb first, an experimental, private ritual, and then onto her ring finger. It fit in a way that surprised her, snug enough to feel real, loose enough to be removed if needed. They did not call it engagement. They didn't announce it. They called it a promise, and it lived in their daily agreements, a symbol that marked a decision to build a life with explicit terms. They celebrated modestly with Donna Rosa over dinner in Recife, where the mother sliced the cake with a steady hand and said, "Promises are good when they feed the table." The months carried on. The fellowship completed its first cycle with a small showcase. The cohort produced work that found homes in small municipalities and social programs. Júlia continued to accept projects that aligned with her values and declined those that did not. Her name appeared more frequently on panels, and she was asked to review grant applications.
small tokens of legitimacy in a career built by many small, stubborn choices. Leonardo changed too. His posture in meetings softened. He listened more and advocated less for his own good. He took on projects that prioritized community over client spectacle. He found meaning in the fellowship's small wins in a way that outstripped the simple pleasure of adding a new title to a resume. In quiet moments, he would show her a short entry in the list he'd kept hidden in his desk, where he'd written down the things that mattered: names of people he'd helped, the times he'd refused to cut corners, the mistakes he wanted to avoid repeating. He began to cross out some entries and add others, as if editing a life toward clarity. Not every scene was smooth. 16 months after the letter on the plane, a spat of criticism arrived from a blog that misunderstood the fellowship as a product of his wealth rather than her stewardship. The piece insinuated that the fellowship was another example of a man buying influence. The comments strained toward the sensational. For a few days, Júlia felt the old shame flare, the fear that people would think she had been given everything in exchange for her silence. It hurt because it was close to the bone. They handled it the way they'd long agreed to handle strain, directly and publicly. Leonardo wrote a short response, acknowledging that he had read her letter without permission and that he had apologized for it at the time. He made clear the fellowship's governance model and Júlia's role as curator. Júlia published an essay that explained, without melodrama, how the fellowship came to be, focusing on the agency of the fellows, the local partners, and the slow, iterative decisions that shaped the program. The public response was not uniform. Some critics remained unconvinced. Some readers wrote with gratitude. The piece did not erase the accusation, but it reframed the narrative toward transparency. In private, they nursed the hurt together. The ring sat on her finger like a small piece.
They reminded each other of the practices they'd created: monthly review meetings, shared calendars, a habit of calling each other before public statements. The measures did not eradicate suspicion, but they eased the work of living. Years, in their particular way, accumulated into a life that was not neat, but was steady. Júlia visited Recife more than she had imagined she would, with Leonardo sometimes joining and sometimes not. She had a small apartment in São Paulo that felt like a studio, and a modest room in her mother's house that served as her Recife desk. She taught workshops, mentored young designers, and continued to defend the idea that design could be a civic act rather than an adornment. One afternoon, in a small ritual that seemed both private and public, Júlia sat at her kitchen table and wrote a new letter. It was not the tear-stained plea from years earlier, and it was not a surrender. It was a gratitude note, a short, formal thing she intended to send to people who had accompanied her in the last 2 years: Mariana, the Raiz team, the fellows, the cooperative vendors, even Leonardo in a private line. She wrote in Portuguese and then translated the essential sentences into a cleaner English, the bilingual text folding into the voice that had carried her work. The letter read in the way that gratitude can: "Thank you for seeing me when seeing mattered. Thank you for the doors you left open. Thank you for teaching me to keep making, always." It was an odd, corrective thing to write, a record that her trajectory had not been a single miraculous leap, but a braided rope of many hands and steady labor. She signed it carefully with her full name and a small sketch in the margin, a hand-drawn icon that referenced the cooperative logo and the shape of her home. She left the old plain letter folded in its drawer, no longer a map of desperation, but a waypoint on a journey. Sometimes, on the rare nights when she couldn't sleep, she took it out and folded it again, feeling the weight of its original urgency, and then she put it back. She had learned to treat the past with the same clean honesty she tried to bring to work, with respect, not reverence. On a quiet morning, Leonardo arrived with 2 coffees and a small package. Inside the package was a photograph, new, shot on a morning when the 2 of them had walked along a market, and beneath it was a line of words: "For all the times you chose to make what matters, messy and beautiful." The gift was a small, clear affirmation of a life they'd chosen to build, imperfect, deliberate, joint. They had a life that required decisions and revisions, and within it the ring remained a simple reminder of a promise to try. Neither had become a caricature of the other's earlier needs. They had both changed. She kept making design that held memory. He kept learning to make introductions without taking the light from the one he introduced.
Between them, their work multiplied in ways that made sense. The fellowship continued. A second cohort launched with modifications suggested by alumni. Raiz expanded into a community stewardship program designed by Júlia. Leonardo helped create a small award, administered independently, that supported stories of community-led change. On the day she mailed the gratitude letters, she stopped by her mother's house and left a fresh loaf of bread. Donna Rosa watched her slide with a quiet pride that needed no translation. "You are home and you are here," her mother said simply. There was no hyperbole, just a steady recognition. The last scene, a small, domestic epilogue rather than a theatrical finale, became the closing of the arc. On an afternoon when rain made the city thinner and closer, Júlia sat at her table with an envelope open and a pen in hand. She had taken the day off from formal meetings to write, and the quiet felt like permission. She wrote in the letter to Leonardo the sort of things people rarely say. Thank you for reading. Thank you for apologizing. Thank you for learning to be smaller where I needed space and bigger when I asked for help. There was humor in it too. Also, learn to fold a map without making me map your map. He read it and laughed, then kissed the corner where she'd scribbled the joke. In the drawer where the plain letter had lived, she placed a new note, a small file labeled Markers, the board minutes from the fellowship, a list of vendors who had stayed, a drawing from a child who had visited the cooperative. The plain letter rested under these new things, part of the base, not the whole structure. She looked once more at the small band on her finger, the quiet promise, and thought of the man in the plane months ago whose fingers had moved before his mind did. The moment had been imperfect, an intrusion redeemed only by apology, respect, and the work that followed. It was not the tale of being saved. It was an example of what can happen when someone notices and then works to do better. The shocking part, she believed now, was not that a millionaire's shoulder became a cradle for a resume. The shock was that someone looked at someone else's private fear and chose to act with sustained respect, and that the recipient of that action built a life with her own hands. She sealed the letter and addressed it to the cohort alumni, to friends, to the women who had offered help along the way. She signed it with her name and the tiny icon she used for her studio. Before she walked to the mailbox, she paused and placed the old folded plain letter back into the drawer, under the new notes, and with a small, private smile closed the desk. Outside, the city moved in its habitual, unpredictable flow. Her life was not tidy. Some projects were delayed. Some vendors still argued over sign placement. Travel was exhausting.
But she had work she loved, a mother who was close enough to taste her successes, a partner who had learned to offer support without consuming the agency that made her successful. She had a hand-drawn portfolio that led projects and a ring that was a promise of steady presence rather than a claim of ownership. She thought of the airplane the papers sliding between seats, the awkwardness of sleeping against a stranger. In that strange, small scene had been a pivot, an ethical misstep, an apology, introductions that opened doors, her own relentless labor that turned openings into rooms. It was a chain reaction that was neither purely chance nor simple design, but a mixed kind of human luck, fragile, repairable, real. If this moved you, leave one line about the person who helped you when you needed it most, and share this story with someone who needs hope.